So we're here sitting on Sol LeWitt's art. And so I thought I wanted to start by asking you about your own connection with LeWitt's work or with conceptual art in general.
Well, I never know how to answer that. I met Sol LeWitt later in life, kind of. He lived in Chester, Connecticut. Andrea Keller was a friend of mine. She was the curator of the Lions Gallery at the Wadsworth Museum in Hartford. And she's Sol LeWitt's, she's the expert on Sol LeWitt. She knew him, did all, expert on him. And one day she was telling me about Sol had a collection of other people's work.
Mm-hmm.
She said he would give you a work if you gave him a work. I said, well, I'd love to. I said I would be embarrassed. She said, you should ask him. I said, I don't know. She said, no, he'd be delighted. So I asked him, he said, sure. So I gave him a score of mine, a string quartet, and he gave me a wall drawing, which I executed in my house in pencil. It's a score. It's like a prose score. It's like a musical score. It tells you what to do.
A set of instructions.
Yeah, a set of instructions. And very simple. It said, start in the lower left-hand corner of a wall and draw a diagonal up to the right corner. Easier said than done. How do you draw a diagonal?
Yeah.
So I had to go to a cabinet maker to get me a piece of wood that was straight. And I put the piece of wood there and I traced the line with a pencil. It said, any line, any irregular line from the midpoint to the middle of that diagonal. So I just drew a sort of like Morse code.
Right, a Morse code line.
Then he said, from the middle where those lines intersect, draw an arc from the diagonal up. So I had to sign a little pencil and a yardstick. And I drew this arc forward. The last instruction was any line from the top to the middle. So there's this nice drawing, which I executed. And he had to come and check it and make sure he liked it. He was very strict about that. He would go and check and see that his pieces were executed the right way. I remember seeing a show of his work at Andover Academy. Everything was beautiful except one student was recalcitrant, drew a little line that didn't belong there on the bottom, and it spoils it. Anyway, he said it was okay. I had to write the words wall drawing anywhere on the drawing. I could have written it anywhere. So I wrote wall drawing down on the left side. His name's not on it, so I own that piece.
So it's really like your relationship, like the relationship of a performer to the composer was your relationship to him. He basically gave you a score and you executed it, and then he approved.
I have to tell you one more story about him. I had a student from Zug, Switzerland, which is a lovely art gallery there. And they were going to have Sol LeWitt to do a wall drawing there. Mm-hmm. The student of mine was going to supply music for the opening of the show, okay? His wife played piano, he was a trombone player. I had made him a piece a few years before using a photograph of the Alps taken from his city in Zug, beautiful panoramic photograph. So I had made that piece where the trombone slides up and down. So I took him with me to visit Sol as I gave Sol my score for. So I said to Sol, I hear you're going to do a wall drawing in Zug. He said, yes, I am. I said, do you know what it's going to be? He said, I don't know yet. It could be an old one. Then I told him the story about that I'd written a piece for the trombone player. he said, "Do you have that photograph?" I said, "Yes." He said, "That's my wall drawing." So he made this beautiful wall drawing in Zug, and we executed it at Westland. There's one artist with a black magic marker drawing any segment of that panoramic photograph
Oh, nice.
on top. A second artist below that with blue, or I forget the primary colors, drawing as close as he or she can to that. A third artist using yellow and red, alternating all the way down the wall.
But each one in their own free hand.
Yeah, but trying to keep it as so of course at the bottom it's distorted.
Right.
And it's just beautiful. And he's used that idea several times. So that was a case where I sort of gave him an idea in a funny way.
Well, that's interesting to me because I've been thinking about the relationship of ideal states and the imperfection of performance while working on In Memoriam John Higgins, where, there is an idea that you can conceptualize that's absolutely perfect. I mean, it's completely clear that these interference patterns are going to happen in an orderly way. But of course, it's, as a performer, you know that you're never going to quite realize it perfectly.
Absolutely, sure.
So is that part of the design of the piece, that there's a gap between the perfection of the idea and the imperfection of the performance?
I don't think about that explicitly, but the reason I have a performer and not another oscillator is because of that, isn't it? I remember when I did my alpha wave piece, my brainwave piece.
Music for solo performer.
Music for solo performer, 10 cycles, alpha wave, go 10 cycles, very low, 10, 11 cycles. Some people say, why don't you use an oscillator?
Right.
Well, that's a stupid idea. Oscillators are totally periodic. Who wants to hear that? Alpha waves, periodic, but they're imperfect. They rise and they fall. They're natural phenomena, much more interesting than to use something totally fixed. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Although it's a tightrope walk as a performer, but that's what makes it interesting to do it.
I remember once Abraham and Senya, who's a West African, he's a wonderful percussion player from West Africa.
Right, and he was on faculty at
faculty,
Wesleyan for many years.
If anyone can keep time, he can, okay? I remember once we had him playing periodic on the drum. Of course, it wasn't perfect, was it? I mean, you'd think this master player could keep beat perfectly, but it wasn't. It was a little bit off each time, which proves something about rhythm and perception and the way it's interesting. His playing was wonderful partly because of that. It's not perfect.
That's the human element.
Yeah.
So I also wanted to ask you a somewhat related question, which has to do with I Am Sitting in a Room, which you're going to perform tomorrow night, and which I heard you do live down in New York a few years ago. And the thing that interests me many things interest me about that piece, but I've always been intrigued by it's a piece more than any other piece that I know of that lets the audience in on the secret. I mean, talk about composer not being privy to anything, as Jim Tenney said. I mean, the piece is you telling the audience what you're doing and what they're going to hear. But what I wanted to ask you about was the last sentence. Is that enough of a question, or should I continue the question?
That's okay, go ahead.
Because it takes a very personal turn at that point. And it goes from being very matter of fact and a simple description of a process. And suddenly you're talking about something that seems to me very personal, and again very human. And I'm just wondering about that decision.
Well, you know, I sat there that night. I set up my equipment. I was living in an apartment in Middletown. And I just wrote that text out almost in real time, almost. I just wrote it out, and I don't know why I said that exactly. I just did it. I didn't think about it. So I guess I'd done a piece by Bob Ashley, I think, called Fancy Free, maybe, in which he had me speaking. He had 4 cassette players who would record and if I stuttered or even hesitated, they would rewind the tapes. It was that kind of listening to speech, everybody's speech. You stop and start, you hesitate a little bit each time. I think I was thinking of that, for example, and because I do stutter. What do I say at the end? Smooth out any irregularities.
Yeah.
Well, everyone has irregularities in their speech. So I was thinking about everyone's speech, not just my own.
The interesting thing about it, to me, is that that sentence ends up resonating in 2 different ways. I mean, obviously it resonates acoustically, so I suppose it resonates in 3 ways, but I mean, you do hear this process of articulation losing itself and becoming longer tones and sustained tones, but because of the repetition, these irregularities become very melodic and very beautiful in their own right. And now that I've heard you do the piece many times, every time it's a different melody, but it's always a really compelling melody. So to me, it smooths it out both by erasing it, but also by repeating it. And I guess my question is, would you have anticipated with that piece, you know, which so obviously you sat in a room, you made it as a tape piece, it having this performance life, was that in your mind, or was that not a...
No, Reinhard Oschlegel in Germany was doing broadcasts for the German station. He suggested I do it as a live performance. So the first times I did, I used tape loops. I have a machine on one side, tape recorder on the other side, running a loop across. The length of the loop was enough time for me to speak the text, and it would record on one side and play back on the other.
Right. How big a length was that, just out of curiosity?
Well, you could figure it out. The speech is 1 minute and 10 seconds, usually. Tape loops going 7.5 inches, 15 inches a second. We used to just do it.
Right. Amazing.
Then, of course, you don't need tape anymore, but with computers. And so I think it's okay to do it this way, don't you think?
I think it's fantastic to do it this way. I just want every single version. I mean, at the sound check, I wanted to have a recording of every single version, actually. Well. Since we're on the subject of that piece, and since we're here at MIT, and you wrote me in an email when we were discussing doing this piece that the idea for the piece had been triggered by the work of Bose, who had been here.
Well, I had worked with a scientist on my brainwave piece early in 1965. He was working with the Air Force in Hanscom Field on epilepsy. Some pilots were blacking out. The planes were landing propeller planes. And he was a wonderful scientist, and he lent me his brainwave amplified differential amplifier and so on. One day in the hallway at Brandeis, he was just walking through. He said, you know, last night I went to a lecture at MIT by this man, Bose, who's developing a loudspeaker. And he tests his speakers by recycling sounds back into the speakers. That's all he told me. He didn't say anything about whether it was in the room or how that worked. He just mentioned that process in passing. I thought, well, that's something I should try out, and I did. And that's how I got this piece. I don't know anything more. I should look it up and see what exactly Bose was doing. All I knew is that there was this repetitious process, recycling. It was important to do it into the room again. That was the whole idea, I think. That's all I know. Isn't that strange? I mean, I feel badly. I can't
No, I don't think you should feel badly about that at all.
I didn't investigate at all.
Well, in a way, you were your own LeWitt for that piece, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you created a process and then you followed it.
Yeah.
So on what repetition did you think this is getting magical?
Well, I stayed up all night doing it, to avoid sounds from outside, and it just, I was busy doing it. I was trying to make sure that the recordings weren't distorted, repetition. And I stayed up all night and I went to bed. I suppose I thought it was wonderful. I thought it was wonderful, but somehow it didn't hit me till later, I don't think, how interesting it was. I don't know.
The idea, to get an idea for a piece from an overheard conversation about a loudspeaker experiment is, I mean, much of your work seems to take its cue from work that's being done, in the sciences or in the labs. And I just wonder where that inclination comes from in you.
I don't know. I was never very good at science in school. I wasn't.
Me either. I don't know why they keep me.
Well, because you do other things. I never figured out physics or very much. But when I was in Europe on my Fulbright, I heard all this European music, Nono and Boulez and Stockhausen. I thought, how wonderful it is, but it's not my music. If I wrote music with serialism or extension of serialism, it's their music. Those guys love that. I used to go to Darmstadt for that. They would give talks on it. It was their work. It was in their blood. It wasn't in my blood. And I came home and I met Edmond Dewan at Brandeis. I don't know why he was there. He said, I have this brainwave amplifier and I'm trying to interest these composers in doing something with my alpha wave experiment. He said, but they think it's a gimmick and silly. Well, I didn't have any ideas at that time, so I didn't think it was too silly. It's wonderful to have your mind blank.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd been in Europe, I heard all this music. I'd gone over as a Stravinsky addict, and I was at a loss. What kind of music am I going to write? I can't continue neoclassicism. I don't feel good about serialism. I'll give this a try. So that opened me up to this, this experimenting. The wonderful thing about the brainwave piece is you don't do anything. You sit there and you don't move. Most music, the violinist is, the pianist are doing all of it. You sit quietly and let this natural phenomenon happen.
You need to let your mind
rest, yeah. So I did this piece in 1965. Can you imagine? That's so long ago. And people said, well, why don't you now experiment with other kind of waves, brain waves? I'm not interested in brain, I'm interested in making a piece of music. Percussion. I've been a percussionist in my college band. I was a snare drummer. And my inclination was to use percussion. When I saw, I was at Brandeis at that time in Cambridge. AR and ALH were developing these acoustic suspension loudspeakers. It was the first stereo, it was one. And we had a KLH loudspeaker in the studio, and when I was generating alpha waves, I could see the cone of the speaker moving.
Right.
It's actually physically moving. I thought, well, this speaker is a performer.
Right.
It's not just a...
It's a robot, basically. Yeah.
It's a performer. It's like, so my idea was that it would resonate percussion instruments. Actually, the piece is about resonance. I think more than it is about alpha waves. The resonance of each percussion is very different. A gong takes heavy bursts of alpha to make it sound, a big tam-tam. A snare drum is the ace percussion instrument of all time. Any sound would make it, any sound from outside impinging on those snares make them sound. So you have this whole set of 16 instruments. I had a piano, I had put a loudspeaker in a cardboard box, I had timpani, gongs, cymbals, and each one resonated in a different way. So the piece is more about that than it is about generating alpha waves in a funny way. So that got me going, and then I taught a course in acoustics with a professor. I shared with the professor. We did the Pythagorean string using a magnet, electromagnet, on a table. I thought, well, this is wonderful. What would happen if I had a long wire and not just this one fit on? So I bought some long wire. I went to Edmond's scientific catalog, got a magnet, a used Navy. I didn't know what the value of the magnet was. I didn't know, and I just set the wire up and I got it to vibrate. And there was this piece, music on a long, thin wire,
Right.
which I did sort of off the top of my head without knowing too much. I can't tell you what the impedance, I figured out the impedance of the wire was such and such, but I didn't know too much about that.
It's interesting to me that the brainwave piece came at a point where you felt at a compositional dead end, and you, as you yourself put it, had no ideas.
Yeah.
And, you know, in a sense, you literally went into your brain and explored the no idea.
Yeah, I guess so.
And out of that came the piece.
Yeah.
Because so many of your pieces start from this isolation of getting the mind or the ears or preconceptions or other music or other sounds to just get out of the way.
Yeah.
And what I find really interesting about that, I remember seeing a percussionist do the triangle piece, Silver Streetcar of the orchestra.
Yeah.
And he did it actually in a resonant room like this. So he actually didn't need any amplification at all. And it was incredible. You know, I could have listened to it for an hour. I think it went on for 20 minutes or so, but an hour would have been fine. And then afterwards, it was actually at a music school, and all the students rushed. And that's another piece where there's no secrets. It's just a guy holding a triangle, and you know, it's just these beautiful overtones forever. And afterwards, all the students rushed up to him, demanding that he reveal the secret. You know, how are you amplifying that? What processing were you using? And I've seen this happen over and over again with your pieces. With I Am Sitting in a Room, you tell everybody what you're doing, and you tell them how you're doing it, but nobody can believe it's really that straightforward.
You know, I think the Judson Dancers, I used to go to the Judson dance concerts in the 60s. And one of the dancers, I think, did a piece where she is telling you what she's doing while she's doing it. Now I'm moving my left arm, and now I'm moving this, and telling you exactly the content of the process was the content. Steve Reich's music, to his early music, I think, for tape recorders, you know what's happening. He's not hiding.
Right.
It's not like in serial music where you have a tone rose complex. You don't hear these, you don't hear the structure.
Right.
It's hidden. But I thought it was so wonderful just to reveal what you're doing. I think somebody said my music is about revealing sounds that are always there, but you've never heard them exactly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes complete sense, and it has for me, this constantly refreshing quality. That's a personal response, but I always feel kind of clarified after I hear your music.
The piece that you're playing, Frederick Stravsky said, why don't you alter the sine wave with your hand, play it?
Right.
I said, well, once you change it, then you have to have another change. And you're dealing with relationships between pitches and so forth. The piece isn't about that. I chose the lower extremity of the instrument to the higher.
Yeah.
And the sine wave goes at the same speed. You don't have to change speed because the speed of the beating doubles each octave.
Right.
So built into it is change. And of course, I can't hope to understand what happens within an octave. I mean, what the mathematics is the speed of the beating within an octave. It must be very complex, but you know what I mean? So you don't have to change anything. There are changes already in there.
Well, as a performer, I mean, the thing that's interesting to me about that piece is that, of course, when you play music, you're playing it even when you're playing it alone, you're playing it in the room, and it's changing by the room, and it's changing by the other people you're playing with. But in that piece, the alchemy of holding a note.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just standing there holding a note, and suddenly it's not holding still, and then I have to be still inside myself to not react to the fact that this form of, it's almost like being on unstable ground, like the first time I experienced an earthquake, and I thought, I must be fainting or something because the ground isn't supposed to move. And with that piece, it's so simple, and I'm holding a note, and suddenly the entire room is vibrating, including me.
Sometimes things happen. I don't know they're going to happen too. If you let a process work itself out without interfering with it, you find a lot of interesting things. In the mid-range of that piece, the waves move in the space. And I'm not exactly sure why, except I know that the wavelengths are getting shorter and shorter as you rise in pitch, and the reverberation off the walls is moving, and the wave is spinning around your head. It's just happening by itself. Nothing is changing in the electronics at all. And that was a wonderful thing to discover.
So do you regard, you have talked about the difference between expression and expressing yourself in music. And do you feel the need to impose a listening experience on the listener? Do you want the listener to hear it the way you're hearing it? Or
I think so, yeah. Someone said, I don't know, it was like, instead of listening to what's happening, you're paying attention to how you are listening to it. You're thinking to yourself, how am I doing this? Does that make sense?
That's what you want.
I don't know whether it's what I want, but that's what people say they feel while they're listening. They're examining themselves, saying, how am I doing this? Instead of presenting them with something complete, like Beethoven, piano sonata. Beethoven's taking you from key to key and controlling what you're hearing. I'd like it if people start going inward, I don't know, and examining themselves as they are listening.
So it more is giving them the space for self-reflection.
I think so, something like that, yeah.
Well, I want to hear more about what Ghedini thought about your...
Oh, Ghedini, he was... Well, he loved my music, because at that point I was writing Stravinsky-like music.
Did you keep those? Do you have...
I have some of those pieces.
Do you ever have them played?
Every once in a while.
Really?
Yeah.
Are you ever going to reveal them to
There's
the
one
world?
piano piece that I did a celebration of my work. I did that piece. I did a flute and harpsichord concerto.
I'd love to hear those
Yeah.
pieces. You know, when I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley in the
Yeah.
80s, we found in the basement a graduate student recital from the late 50s with Lamont
Young.
and Terry and a lot of other people, actually David Del Tredici,
Wow.
and I think Ramon Sender,
Ramon Sender.
yeah, and somebody else that was still, Robert Helps maybe?
Oh, Robert helps.
Maybe, I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
But, and they were all writing serial music. And I don't know what happened to that tape, but I mean, Lamont was this kind of Stockhausen Klavierstück, like really, really crazy, complicated serial piece. And I don't think Pauline was on that, but it was kind of an amazing document. So, you know, like finding a time machine. But it would be great to hear your pieces from that period. Or do a blindfold, you know, like a downbeat drop the needle test, like name the composer. You could stump a lot of people. So then you went straight, you were doing that and then you just stopped, and then the next thing was?
I was in Rome for 2 years. I studied with a man called, I forget his name. He was Petrassi's assistant, Boris Porena. We didn't do much. We looked at some tone row pieces.
So you dabbled. You
A
tried
little
to
bit.
do
I
that.
wrote one piece, I think.
Yeah.
Fragments for strings, and the Diddy Quartet recorded that
Oh wow.
with a Lamont Young piece called something about ways to look at a naiad or something. It's a little serial piece, I think.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So that's available.
It's available, but it was a phony piece in a certain way. That 12-tone music was kind of a fraud. I think you choose pitches and you just do it by eye, and
Yeah.
you go up, you do, you know, it was okay, but
I remember what I was introduced to. It was the same time I was introduced to your music. It was when I was 13 years old.
oh my Lord.
We had, in my high school in Evanston, Illinois, we had this unbelievably cool older woman who taught this class called Materials of Music. It was supposed to be the music theory class. And she just wanted to play us weird music. This would have been in the early 70s, right? So she had all the Columbia Odyssey recordings. She played, we heard Come Out, played us Ives, played I'm Sitting in a Room. So I heard that piece very...
Don't you love teachers like that?
Yeah, no, she changed...
Wonderful teachers.
Changed my life. But then she taught us about serial music and assigned us to write a serial piece. And I remember doing it, you know, in my history class. You know, the same thing, just completely...
Yeah.
I mean, for some people, I think it becomes a real process. But for me, it was also completely art. It had nothing to do with the way I
And I knew
thought about
that.
music.
I couldn't continue writing music like that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you didn't. I mean, not for the sake of serialism, but for what you ended up
Well, I'm
doing.
writing instrumental pieces a lot now since the 80s, because players ask me to make pieces.
Yeah.
Someone say, well, why don't you write a clarinet piece? I say, well, how do I do that? And then I tried to find a way to get the same aesthetic or the same feeling with instruments that I did with electronics only.
But there's the pieces are very human and they're very theatrical. And I mean, you don't specify things like the demeanor of the of the performer. You do specify certain things about the staging, but do you think of those pieces as having a theatrical element? I mean, or is it just, well, not just, I guess that's the question. Do you think of those pieces as having a theatrical element?
Not exactly. I don't think so, but... not really.
Okay.
I guess it's hard to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Because I think even with I Am Sitting in a Room doing it live, I know from talking to people that were at the New York performance, you know, that were not primarily musicians, you know, visual artists and
In
theater
the
artists.
atrium, you mean? The
Yeah,
bang
yeah.
on the can?
Yeah, the Bang on a Can performance, that people saw it in a sense as a kind of performance art
Oh.
piece, and as a very effective one, you know. But that's an unintended consequence, I suppose.
Well, performance art was very important. I think it enabled you to do a piece like that. You wouldn't have to justify it as music or anything. You know what I'm saying?
I suppose, but I mean, on the other hand, I can just imagine if after you spoke the sentence, you kind of went and got a cup of coffee or something, it would have a very different, you know, effect than the effect that it has of you sitting there.
I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't.
Well, you never know, but you know, just that there's something very powerful about the human. As soon as you add an actual human being, that becomes part of the experience. But you know, I guess we're all going to impose our own assumptions on the listening experience as much as we try to get clear. Anyway, thanks.
You're
This
welcome.
was really
Thank you. You know, MIT has often been you know, when you get old, it's wonderful. I have a friend who turned 80. I said, how do you feel? She said, wonderful, you can see how things have turned out. I remember at Brandeis coming, Stockhausen was here. He was young, he was in his young. He gave a lecture on Gesang die Jünglinge here at MIT.
wow.
I remember that. He was amazing, this young German guy, very military, talking about this, how he made this piece. Then years later, in the 60s, John Cage and David Tudor came in the middle of a snowstorm, did a concert at MIT. There were only like 12 people, 15 people in the audience. It was wonderful. I saw David Tudor's table of electronics, wires hanging down, and things didn't work right. And I thought my teachers at Brandeis should come to a concert like this because they were getting bitter. Nobody was playing their music. And I thought, Cage and Tudor, they're not waiting for somebody to play. They're touring around by themselves.
Right.
Hard work, getting up, traveling, setting up it was inspiring. I thought, this is what music can be.
Right.
That was at MIT, so MIT's been an important place for me.
Well,
somehow.
You are important to MIT as well. No, I'm serious. I mean, our students know your music often because my colleagues and I play it for them, but they hear it. They get it. It doesn't need to be sold to them. It somehow resonates with these students. So thanks for that.
You're welcome.